According to Diane, the report had been filed by a homeowner claiming that Marcus's vehicle was creating a visual obstruction and potential safety hazard. When Marcus asked who filed the complaint, Diane hesitated before explaining that while she couldn't officially disclose that information, the complaint had come from a concerned neighbor at 2847 Maple Drive. That was Linda's address. Marcus decided to handle it diplomatically. That evening, he walked over to Linda's house and knocked on her door. She answered with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, her arms crossed defensively before he'd even said hello. When Marcus politely asked about the parking complaint, explaining that his car was fully within his property lines, Linda's expression hardened. She launched into a lengthy monologue about neighborhood standards, property values, and the importance of maintaining a certain aesthetic. According to Linda, even though his car might technically be in his driveway, the angle at which it was parked was unsightly and brought down the tone of the street. Marcus tried to reason with her, pointing out that many neighbors parked at various angles in their driveways, but Linda was unmoved. She suggested, with barely concealed condescension, that perhaps Marcus wasn't familiar with how things work in quality neighborhoods. Marcus returned home frustrated but determined to let it go. He adjusted the Mustang to park perfectly straight, parallel to his garage door. Problem solved, he thought. He was wrong. The second complaint arrived 4 days later. This time, Linda reported that Marcus's Tesla was parked too close to the property line and creating difficulty for her when she backed out of her own driveway. Marcus measured again. His car was a full 8 feet from the property line, well within regulations. He called Diane once more, who apologized profusely and dismissed the complaint as unfounded. She mentioned off the record that she was starting to notice a pattern with complaints from that particular address, but the complaints didn't stop. Every week, like clockwork, a new violation notice would arrive in Marcus's email. Linda reported his wife's SUV for having a bike rack attached, which constitutes an unapproved vehicle modification visible from the street. She claimed his garbage bins were positioned incorrectly, even though they were in the exact same spot every neighbor used. She reported his outdoor string lights as excessive illumination creating light pollution. She even complained about contractors' vehicles when Marcus had his gutters cleaned, claiming they blocked her view of the street. Marcus began documenting everything. He took time-stamped photos of his vehicles, his property, and even Linda's comings and goings. He noticed that she seemed to spend an unusual amount of time watching his house from her front window. Jennifer started calling her the curtain twitcher because they could see Linda's blinds moving whenever anyone came or went from the Chen household. By the end of the first month, Marcus had received 7 violation notices, all filed by Linda and all dismissed by the HOA management as frivolous. Diane confided that she'd never seen anyone file so many complaints in such a short period, and she'd been managing the Pleasant Valley HOA for 12 years. The situation escalated when Linda started calling the police. The first time, Marcus was working in his garage on a Saturday afternoon with the door open, music playing at a reasonable volume while he detailed the Mustang. 2 officers arrived, responding to a noise complaint. They were apologetic when they arrived, clearly recognizing that the music was barely audible from the street. One of the officers mentioned they'd received multiple calls from the same address over the past few weeks for various trivial matters. Linda called the police about suspicious vehicles when Marcus's parents visited and parked in his driveway. She called about possible code violations regarding his lawn care schedule. She even called claiming his security cameras were invading her privacy, even though they were clearly pointed at his own property. Each time the police came, verified there was no issue, and left. Each time Marcus grew more frustrated. Jennifer suggested they try to make peace. She baked cookies and brought them over to Linda's house, hoping a friendly gesture might ease the tension. Linda accepted the cookies with a stiff smile but closed the door without inviting Jennifer inside. The next day, Marcus received another complaint, this time about excessive foot traffic between the properties constituting a disturbance. Marcus realized he was dealing with someone who had made him her personal project. What he didn't yet understand was why Linda seemed so obsessed with his parking, his property, and his daily life. He also didn't know that Linda was fighting battles of her own, battles that would soon become very public and that would ultimately give Marcus an opportunity for the most satisfying resolution he could have imagined. As summer approached and the complaints continued with relentless consistency, Marcus began to wonder how long this could possibly go on. The answer would surprise him, and the ending would be sweeter than any revenge he could have planned himself. By late April, Marcus had received his 23rd complaint from Linda Hargrove. He'd started keeping a detailed spreadsheet, logging each violation notice with dates, times, photos, and the eventual outcome. Every single complaint had been dismissed by the HOA as baseless, yet Linda showed no signs of stopping. If anything, she seemed to be doubling down on her crusade against the Chen family's parking habits. The complaints had evolved from merely annoying to bizarrely creative. Linda reported that Marcus's Tesla charging cable created a tripping hazard, even though it was coiled neatly beside his garage and never extended beyond his property. She claimed his wife's SUV leaked oil, demanding environmental testing of his driveway. When the HOA sent someone to inspect and found no evidence of any leak, Linda insisted they hadn't looked carefully enough. She filed a complaint about commercial vehicle parking when a friend visited in a pickup truck with his company logo on the door, even though the truck was parked for less than 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon. Marcus had moved beyond frustration into a state of fascinated bewilderment. What drove someone to spend this much time and energy on a neighbor's parking? He began to suspect there was something deeper going on, something that had nothing to do with vehicles or property lines. The first real clue came in early May. Marcus had installed additional security cameras after Linda's complaints about his existing ones. Ironically enough, he wanted to document that his parking was always compliant, creating a time-stamped video record that would definitively prove his vehicles never violated any rules. But the cameras captured something far more interesting than his own driveway. Marcus noticed unusual patterns of activity at Linda's house. Cars would arrive at odd hours, staying for 30 to 45 minutes before leaving. Different cars, different people, but a remarkably consistent schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening between 6 and 8 o'clock, Linda would have 4 to 6 visitors arriving in a staggered pattern. They'd park on the street in front of her house, go inside, and leave roughly 45 minutes later. At first, Marcus assumed she was hosting book club meetings or dinner parties, but something felt off about the precision of it all. The visitors never arrived together, never lingered outside chatting, and never seemed to interact with each other, coming or going. They'd arrive, disappear into Linda's house, and leave exactly 45 minutes later, sometimes passing the next visitor on the walkway with barely a nod. Jennifer noticed it too. One Thursday evening, while Marcus was reviewing his security footage to document his own parking for the latest complaint, she pointed at the screen. "That's the same woman from Tuesday," she said. "Third house down, the blue sedan. She was here on Tuesday at 6:15, and there she is again today at 6:45. Marcus began paying closer attention. He started recognizing the regular visitors. There was the blue sedan woman, the nervous-looking man in the gray Honda, the well-dressed woman in the white Lexus, and several others who appeared with clockwork regularity. The pattern was unmistakable once you saw it. This wasn't social activity. This was business. His curiosity deepened when he noticed the condition of Linda's property beginning to deteriorate. The woman who obsessed over his perfectly maintained parking suddenly seemed unable to keep up with her own yard work. Her grass grew longer between mowings. Weeds appeared in her flower beds. A shutter came loose and hung at an angle for 3 weeks before being fixed. Most tellingly, late payment notices started appearing on her door. Marcus wasn't snooping intentionally, but his security cameras had a wide angle that captured Linda's front porch. He watched as she tore down the notices quickly, glancing around to see if anyone had witnessed them. The notices came from utility companies, from credit card services, from the mortgage company. Each one stayed posted for only minutes before Linda snatched them down, but Marcus's cameras recorded them all. The parking complaints continued unabated. In fact, they seemed to intensify in inverse proportion to Linda's ability to maintain her own property. When Marcus's parents visited for a weekend and parked their RV on the street in front of his house, fully legally and with the required permit, Linda filed 3 separate complaints in a single day. She called the police twice. She even showed up at Marcus's door at 9 o'clock at night, her face flushed with anger, demanding he remove the eyesore immediately. Marcus, maintaining his composure, politely explained that his parents had every right to park there for up to 72 hours, according to both city ordinance and HOA rules. Linda's response was to file another complaint claiming the RV was leaking sewage onto the street. It wasn't, of course, and the accusation was so absurd that even Diane, the usually patient HOA manager, expressed her exasperation in an email to Marcus, apologizing for having to forward yet another baseless complaint. But it was in late June when Marcus discovered what was really happening at Linda's house. He was pulling weeds in his front garden on a Tuesday evening when he noticed a familiar car pull up to Linda's house. The woman who emerged was well-dressed, carrying what looked like a yoga mat bag. She walked quickly to Linda's door, glanced around nervously, and was let inside immediately. Marcus wouldn't have thought anything of it except for what happened next. Another woman arrived 10 minutes later, also with a yoga mat bag, then another. By 6:30, 5 women had entered Linda's house, all carrying similar bags, all with that same furtive quality to their movements. Jennifer came outside to join him, and they watched as the first woman emerged exactly 45 minutes after arriving. She walked quickly to her car, threw the yoga mat bag in the back seat, and drove away. But before she did, the bag shifted, and Marcus saw what was inside. Not a yoga mat, but bottles. Multiple bottles of what appeared to be alcohol. "Is she running some kind of speakeasy?" Jennifer whispered, half joking. Marcus didn't laugh. His mind was racing through the possibilities. The regular schedule, the staggered arrivals and departures, the discreet nature of the visits, the financial troubles evidenced by the late payment notices. This wasn't a book club or a yoga class. This was a business, and businesses run from residential properties in Pleasant Valley required permits, licenses, and HOA approval. He spent the next week observing more carefully. The pattern held consistent. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6 to 8 visitors, 45-minute appointments, but he also noticed weekend activity. On Saturday afternoons, a different set of visitors would arrive, these staying for longer periods, sometimes up to 90 minutes. The visitors on weekends seemed even more discreet, often parking a few houses down and walking to Linda's door. Marcus did some research into what types of businesses might operate on this kind of schedule. Personal training sessions? Possible, but why the secrecy? Therapy or counseling? That would require licensing, tutoring. The visitors seemed too varied in age and demographic. Then Jennifer suggested something that made everything click into place. "What if she's selling something?" Jennifer asked. "Like Mary Kay or Tupperware, but something less legitimate?" Marcus pulled up the Pleasant Valley HOA regulations and read through the section on home-based businesses. The rules were clear. Any business operation from a residential property required written approval from the HOA board, proof of proper business licensing from the city, and compliance with zoning regulations. Certain types of businesses were prohibited entirely, including retail sales that generated significant traffic, any business requiring exterior signage or modifications, and any business that created parking problems for neighbors. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Linda, who had filed dozens of complaints about his parking, was potentially operating an unpermitted business that generated multiple visitor vehicles several times per week. The woman who claimed to be so concerned about neighborhood standards was possibly violating some of the most fundamental HOA regulations. But Marcus wasn't vindictive by nature. He didn't immediately report Linda to the HOA or the city. Instead, he decided to document everything carefully, building an irrefutable case before taking any action. He installed another camera with a better angle on Linda's driveway and front door. He began logging every visitor, noting arrival and departure times, license plates, and any other relevant details. What he discovered over the next month shocked him. Linda was running a remarkably busy operation, whatever it was. She had at least 30 regular clients who visited on a predictable rotation. The business appeared to be generating significant income, or at least significant activity, and absolutely none of it was permitted, licensed, or approved, Marcus also noticed that Linda's financial situation seemed to be deteriorating rapidly despite her apparent business income. More late notices appeared on her door. Her car, a leased BMW, was gone one morning and replaced with an older Toyota. She stopped having her lawn serviced professionally and began mowing it herself, though increasingly infrequently. The house that had looked immaculate when she moved in 6 months ago now showed visible signs of neglect. Yet still the parking complaints continued. Marcus received his 40th complaint in mid-July, this one claiming that his vehicles created visual pollution that negatively impacted property values. Diane's response email was terse. Complaint dismissed. Please disregard. We are addressing the pattern of frivolous complaints with the reporting party. Marcus wondered what addressing meant, but he didn't have to wonder long. 2 days after Diane's email, he found a formal notice posted on Linda's door from the Pleasant Valley HOA. It warned her that continued filing of frivolous complaints could result in fines and potential legal action for harassment. The notice stayed on her door for less than 5 minutes before Linda tore it down, but not before Marcus's camera captured it in perfect detail. That evening, Linda appeared at Marcus's door again. This time, she was trembling with rage. She accused him of turning the HOA against her, of conspiring to harass her, of trying to drive her out of the neighborhood. Marcus, genuinely taken aback by her vehemence, tried to explain that he'd never asked the HOA to take any action against her. He'd simply responded to her complaints by documenting that his parking was compliant. Linda wasn't listening. She launched into a tirade about how people like Marcus thought they could do whatever they wanted, how his expensive cars and his perfect house were deliberately flaunted to make others feel inferior, how he'd had everything handed to him while she'd had to fight for everything. The bitterness in her voice was palpable, and Marcus realized for the first time that this had never really been about parking at all. After Linda stormed back to her house, Jennifer put her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "She's in trouble," she said quietly. "Real trouble. This isn't just about being difficult. Something's falling apart over there." Marcus nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy, despite 6 months of harassment. But his sympathy would be tested in the coming weeks as Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic, her financial situation grew more desperate, and Marcus uncovered exactly what she'd been doing in her house all those evenings. The truth, when he finally pieced it together, would be far more serious than he'd imagined, and it would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. August brought scorching heat to Pleasant Valley, and with it, a noticeable escalation in Linda Hargrove's desperation. Marcus had now received 53 parking complaints, averaging more than 2 per week. But something had shifted in the tone of the complaints. They were becoming increasingly unhinged, filled with capital letters and exclamation points, claiming absurd violations like deliberate vehicle positioning to cause psychological distress and systematic parking harassment campaign. Diane had stopped forwarding them with her usual diplomatic responses. Instead, Marcus received a phone call asking if he'd be willing to meet with her and the HOA board president. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon at the neighborhood clubhouse, and what Marcus learned there painted a troubling picture. According to the board president, a retired attorney named Robert Mitchell, Linda had filed over 200 complaints in the 6 months since moving into Pleasant Valley. Not just against Marcus, though he was her primary target, but against at least a dozen other neighbors. She'd reported one family's children for excessive noise while playing in their own backyard. She'd claimed another neighbor's landscaping violated setback requirements when it clearly didn't. She'd even filed complaints about the color of someone's mailbox, the breed of someone's dog, and the type of flowers in someone's garden. The HOA had tried to work with Linda, Mitchell explained. They'd sent multiple letters asking her to cease filing frivolous complaints. They'd offered mediation services. They'd explained the rules repeatedly, showing her that the things she was complaining about weren't actually violations. Nothing worked. Linda seemed convinced that she was the only person who truly understood what the neighborhood standards should be, and everyone else was deliberately trying to undermine those standards. Mitchell then shared something that made Marcus sit up straighter. The HOA had received several complaints about Linda's property from other neighbors. Not retaliatory complaints, but legitimate concerns about the unusual traffic patterns at her house, the noise in the evenings, and what appeared to be a business operation. The board had sent Linda a letter requesting information about any business activities as required by HOA regulations. Linda had never responded. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He told Mitchell and Diane what he'd observed over the past months: the regular visitors, the consistent schedule, the discreet comings and goings. He showed them the video footage from his security cameras, carefully edited to show only the public areas visible from the street. He explained that he'd been documenting everything because of Linda's constant complaints, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently discovered what appeared to be an unpermitted business operation. Mitchell's expression grew grave as he watched the footage. He made notes about the frequency of visitors, the timing, the patterns. He asked Marcus to provide copies of the recordings, which Marcus had already prepared on a flash drive. Mitchell promised to investigate thoroughly and take appropriate action according to HOA bylaws. What Marcus didn't tell them was what else he'd discovered, because in the past 2 weeks he'd finally figured out exactly what Linda was selling from her house, and it was far more problematic than unauthorized Tupperware parties. It had started when Marcus noticed one of Linda's regular visitors in the grocery store. The woman, who arrived at Linda's house every Thursday at 6:30 with remarkable punctuality, was in the wine aisle, studying bottles with intense focus. Marcus wouldn't have paid attention except that the woman's cart was already filled with wine. Expensive wine. At least 20 bottles, multiple cases worth. The woman noticed Marcus looking and quickly turned away, her face flushing red. She abandoned her cart in the middle of the aisle and hurried toward the exit. It was such odd behavior that Marcus found himself thinking about it all evening. Why would someone who was clearly buying large quantities of wine react with such panic at being seen by a neighbor? Then it clicked. The yoga mat bags, the discreet visits, the 45-minute appointments, the bottles he'd glimpsed in that woman's bag weren't yoga equipment. Linda wasn't running wellness classes or personal training sessions. She was selling alcohol. Marcus did more research. Selling alcohol in California required specific licensing from the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Selling it from a residential property without proper licensing was illegal. Selling it in quantities that suggested retail operation rather than personal consumption was very illegal. If Linda was doing what Marcus suspected, she wasn't just violating HOA rules, she was committing a crime. He confirmed his suspicions over the next week by paying closer attention to what visitors carried in and out of Linda's house. They arrived with empty bags and left with full ones. One visitor's bag split as she walked to her car, and 2 wine bottles rolled onto the driveway. The woman frantically grabbed them, looking around in panic before hurrying away. Another visitor, an older man Marcus recognized from his Thursday visits, stopped at his car and pulled out a bottle to examine it in the streetlight. It was clearly a bottle of wine, the label visible even from Marcus's window. Linda was running an illegal alcohol sales operation from her home. But why? And where was she getting the inventory? The answer to those questions came from an unexpected source. Marcus's business partner, David, came over for dinner in mid-August. As they sat on the back patio, David mentioned that his wife had been complaining about their neighbor who'd started selling wine from home. "Some kind of gray market thing," David explained. "She buys overstock and damaged case wine from distributors at huge discounts, then resells it to individuals for less than retail, but more than she paid. It's technically illegal since she doesn't have a license, but apparently it's a pretty common hustle." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Where does your wife live?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Here in Pleasant Valley," David said. Why Marcus described Linda, and David confirmed that she was indeed the neighbor his wife had mentioned. According to David's wife, Linda had approached several neighbors months ago, offering to sell wine at 20 to 30% below retail prices. She claimed to have connections with distributors and could get premium wines at substantial discounts. Some neighbors had started buying from her regularly, appreciating the convenience and savings. But David's wife had stopped after a few purchases when she noticed something troubling. Some of the bottles seemed off. The labels were slightly damaged, or the fill levels seemed lower than they should be. One bottle had clearly been opened and resealed. When she'd mentioned this to Linda, suggesting perhaps there was a problem with her supplier, Linda had become defensive and hostile, accusing David's wife of trying to damage her reputation. Marcus now understood why Linda's financial situation was deteriorating despite her business activity. She was buying wine at discount, yes, but she was also likely buying damaged or rejected inventory that legitimate retailers wouldn't touch. Her profit margins were probably razor thin, and if she was investing money into inventory that she couldn't sell or that customers rejected, she'd be losing money rather than making it. The pieces were falling into place. Linda had probably started this operation thinking it would be easy income. Maybe she'd lost her job or was going through expensive divorce proceedings. The business had likely worked at first, but as word spread about the quality issues, customers stopped returning. She was stuck with inventory she couldn't move, bills she couldn't pay, and a business model that was unsustainable and illegal. And throughout it all, she'd been obsessively filing complaints about Marcus's parking, perhaps as a way to feel some sense of control in a life that was spiraling out of that very thing. Marcus's sympathy was tempered by the fact that Linda had made his life miserable for 6 months, but he still struggled with what to do about his discovery. Reporting her to the authorities would likely result in criminal charges. The illegal alcohol sales, the lack of licensing, the potential tax evasion. Linda could face serious legal consequences. Before Marcus could decide on a course of action, events took that decision out of his hands. On a Thursday evening in late August, Marcus was working in his home office when he heard shouting from next door. He looked out the window to see Linda on her front porch, arguing with a man in a dark suit. The man was holding what appeared to be legal documents, trying to hand them to Linda while she refused to take them. Her voice carried across the yard, shrill and panicked, insisting there must be some mistake, that she just needed more time. The man finally placed the documents on her porch railing, said something Marcus couldn't hear, and walked back to his car. Linda snatched up the papers, read them, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. She crumpled to her porch steps, the papers falling from her hands. Marcus felt uncomfortable witnessing such a private moment of anguish, but he couldn't look away. Linda sat on her steps for nearly 10 minutes, her head in, her hands, her shoulders shaking. Finally, she gathered the papers and went inside, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Marcus noticed a bright orange notice posted on Linda's front door. It was a foreclosure notice. The house was being seized by the mortgage company for non-payment. Linda had 30 days to vacate the property or face eviction proceedings. Marcus stood in his driveway staring at the notice, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. This was his tormentor, the woman who'd made his life difficult for months, who'd filed dozens of false complaints, who'd harassed him and his family relentlessly, and yet, watching her world collapse felt hollow rather than satisfying. Jennifer came out and stood beside him. "I saw it too," she said quietly. "What are you going to do?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He thought about the months of complaints, the police calls, the constant surveillance from Linda's window. He thought about the illegal business operation, the desperate attempts to make money, the mounting debts and notices. He thought about the woman sobbing on her porch steps, alone and defeated. "I don't know," he finally said. But over the next few days, as Linda's situation became increasingly public, Marcus would have to decide whether to help, to hinder, or simply to stay out of it entirely. Because what he didn't yet know was that Linda's foreclosure would present him with an opportunity that would solve his parking problem permanently, deliver the ultimate ironic justice, and transform the property that had been a source of so much conflict into something that would benefit him for years to come. The foreclosure notice was just the beginning. In the coming weeks, Marcus would learn the full extent of Linda's financial collapse, discover additional secrets about her property and her past, and ultimately make a decision that would change the dynamic of their conflict forever. As he watched Linda's car pull out of her driveway that morning, suitcases visible through the rear window, Marcus wondered where she was going and whether she'd be back. The answer would surprise him, and the consequences would ripple through Pleasant Valley in ways no one could have anticipated. Linda's car returned 3 hours later, the suitcases still visible in the back. She'd apparently had nowhere to go, at least not permanently. Over the next week, Marcus watched as the reality of foreclosure played out in painful detail next door. Linda emerged from her house less frequently, and when she did, she looked haggard and defeated. The traffic to her house stopped completely. No more Tuesday and Thursday visitors, no more discreet appointments. Whatever business she'd been running had shut down, whether by choice or necessity. The parking complaints stopped too. For the first time in 6 months, Marcus's email inbox was blissfully free of HOA violation notices. The sudden silence was almost unsettling after such constant harassment. Marcus found himself occasionally glancing at his phone, half expecting another absurd complaint about his vehicle positioning or driveway usage, but none came. The HOA board sent Linda a formal notice about the unpermitted business operation, but it felt like closing the barn door after the horses had fled. Mitchell called Marcus to inform him that they'd investigated based on his information and confirmed that Linda had been operating an illegal alcohol sales business from her home. They'd referred the matter to the city's Code Enforcement Division and the ABC, but given Linda's impending foreclosure, it seemed unlikely that any significant action would be taken. The house would be someone else's problem soon enough. Marcus learned more about Linda's situation through the neighborhood grapevine. David's wife had talked to other neighbors who'd been approached by Linda's wine business. Apparently, Linda had moved to Pleasant Valley after a contentious divorce that had left her with minimal assets and substantial debt. She'd scraped together a down payment for the house, hoping for a fresh start, but had quickly found herself unable to afford the mortgage payments on top of her other expenses. The wine business had been her attempt to generate income, but as Marcus had suspected, it had been doomed from the start. She'd invested her limited savings into inventory, buying rejected and overstock wine at what she thought were bargain prices. But much of the inventory was damaged or of poor quality, and word had spread quickly about the problems. Customers stopped coming. Linda had tried to expand her operation, spending more money on advertising and better inventory, but she'd only dug herself deeper into debt. The mortgage had gone unpaid for 4 months before the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Linda had apparently believed she could catch up on the payments once her business took off, but the business had never taken off. It had crashed and burned, leaving her with a house full of unsellable wine bottles and a mountain of debt she couldn't escape. Marcus felt a degree of sympathy for Linda's situation, but it was hard to forget 6 months of relentless harassment. The parking complaints hadn't been random or justified. They'd been the actions of someone who saw Marcus's success and stability as a personal affront, who channeled her own frustration and failure into making his life difficult. Understanding why someone behaved badly didn't erase the impact of that behavior. 2 weeks after the foreclosure notice appeared, a new sign went up in Linda's yard. Property auction, September 15th. The house would be sold at public auction to the highest bidder, with all proceeds going to satisfy the mortgage debt. Linda would receive nothing and would be required to vacate immediately following the sale. Marcus stood in his driveway looking at the auction sign, and an idea began to form. It was audacious, perhaps even petty, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He could buy Linda's house. Jennifer thought he was joking when he first mentioned it. "Why would we want her house?" she asked. "We have a house. A perfectly good house that we love." Marcus explained his reasoning. The properties were adjacent, and Linda's house sat on a lot that, combined with their own, would create a significantly larger parcel. They didn't need the house itself, but the land could be incredibly valuable. They could demolish the structure and expand their own property. They could create the guest parking area they'd always wanted, ironically solving the very problem that Linda had complained about for 6 months. Or they could simply hold the property as an investment and sell it later when the market improved. But Jennifer saw through his practical justifications to the emotional truth underneath. "You want to buy it because it's her house?" she said. "Because after everything she put us through, There's a certain justice in it. Marcus couldn't deny it. Yes, there was an element of poetic justice in the idea. The woman who'd obsessed over his parking would lose her house to him, and he'd turn it into exactly what she'd claimed to hate, a place for vehicles. But it wasn't just about revenge or vindication. It was also a sound financial decision. The property would likely sell below market value at auction, and the location made it a valuable acquisition. Marcus began researching foreclosure auctions. The process was straightforward but required preparation. Bidders had to register in advance, provide proof of funds, and be prepared to pay a significant deposit immediately if they won. The remaining balance would be due within 30 days, and the property would be sold as is, with no inspections or contingencies. He drove by the courthouse to review the auction details posted in the public records. Linda's house had an outstanding mortgage balance of $340,000. The property had been appraised at $420,000 when she'd purchased it, but the market had softened slightly since then. Marcus estimated it might sell for anywhere from $300,000 to $350,000 at auction, depending on how many bidders showed up. Marcus had the financial resources to make this happen. His business had been particularly profitable over the past few years, and he and Jennifer had been conservative with their investments. They'd been considering buying a rental property anyway. This would be unconventional, but it fit their financial goals. He hired a real estate attorney to review the property records and ensure there were no hidden liens or complications. The attorney's investigation revealed some interesting information. Linda had taken out a second mortgage on the property just 3 months after purchasing it, borrowing against the equity to fund her wine business. That second mortgage, from a private lender rather than a traditional bank, carried an interest rate of almost 12%. Linda had been drowning in debt from the moment she'd moved in. The attorney also discovered something else. Linda had never properly registered her business with the city or obtained the required permits. The Code Enforcement Division had opened an investigation based on the HOA's complaint, and there were now multiple violations on record. If Linda had remained in the house, she would have faced thousands of dollars in fines. The foreclosure had saved her from that particular consequence, at least. As the auction date approached, Marcus made his preparations. He secured a cashier's check for $50,000 to serve as his deposit, arranged a line of credit to cover the full purchase price, and registered as a bidder. He told only Jennifer and his attorney about his plans. He didn't want word getting around the neighborhood and potentially driving up the bidding. 3 days before the auction, Marcus saw Linda for what would be the last time as neighbors. She was loading boxes into her car, clearly in the process of moving out ahead of the forced eviction. Marcus considered walking over to say something, though he wasn't sure what. "Goodbye? Good luck? I'm sorry it came to this." All of it felt inadequate and possibly cruel. But before he could decide, Linda looked up and saw him watching. Their eyes met across the 2 driveways, across the property line that had been the source of so much conflict. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. But then her face hardened into the familiar mask of resentment, and she turned away, shoving another box into her car with more force than necessary. Jennifer came out and stood beside Marcus. "She's really leaving," she said softly. "She doesn't have a choice," Marcus replied. "Are you still going to the auction?" Marcus nodded. He'd thought about it extensively over the past 2 weeks, examining his motivations from every angle. Was this revenge? Partially, he had to admit. But it was also opportunity. The property made sense as an investment. The location was perfect. And yes, there was an undeniable satisfaction in the symmetry of it all. The woman who'd complained endlessly about his parking would lose her house to him, and he'd use it to create the very thing she'd claimed to despise. "I'm going," he confirmed. The auction took place on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. Marcus arrived early, registering at the clerk's desk and receiving his bidder number. He'd expected a crowd, but only 5 other people showed up to bid. The real estate market had cooled significantly, and foreclosure auctions had lost their appeal for many investors. The auctioneer began promptly at 10 o'clock, reading the legal description of the property and the terms of sale. The starting bid was set at $250,000, well below the mortgage balance. This was typical for foreclosure auctions designed to generate bidding activity. Marcus waited as two other bidders competed, driving the price up slowly. At $290,000, one bidder dropped out. At $310,000, the second bidder hesitated, and Marcus saw his opening. He raised his paddle, bidding $315,000. The auctioneer acknowledged his bid. $315,000 from bidder number 7. Do I hear 320 silence? The other bidder shook his head and stepped back. $315,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to bidder number 7 for $315,000. Just like that, Marcus owned Linda Hargrove's house. The practical implications hit him as he signed the paperwork and provided his deposit check. He now owned 2 adjacent properties, which meant 2 sets of property taxes, 2 lots to maintain, and a house full of whatever Linda had left behind. The attorney had warned him that foreclosed properties often came with abandoned belongings, and Marcus would be responsible for disposal. The bank gave him 30 days to complete the purchase and take possession. Marcus spent that time finalizing his financing, conducting a thorough inspection of the property, and planning what to do with it. The inspection revealed that the house was in decent structural condition, but needed cosmetic updates. More interesting was what the inspectors found in the garage and basement. Approximately 300 bottles of wine, most of it cheap or damaged inventory that Linda had never been able to sell. Marcus hired an estate sale company to deal with the contents of the house. Most of it was ordinary furniture and household items, which sold quickly. The wine presented a more complicated problem. Much of it was unsellable due to damage or questionable storage conditions. Marcus ended up donating what was salvageable to a charity auction and disposing of the rest. On October 15th, exactly 1 month after the auction, Marcus received the keys to Linda's former house. He walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on the bare floors. Evidence of Linda's occupancy remained. Marks on the walls where furniture had stood, a few forgotten items in closets, the faint smell of her perfume still lingering in the primary bedroom. Marcus stood in the living room where Linda had presumably conducted her wine business, where dozens of customers had come seeking deals and left dissatisfied. He thought about the desperation that had driven her to this illegal operation, the poor decisions that had compounded her financial problems, and the misplaced anger she'd directed at him for 6 months. But he also thought about the dozens of false complaints, the police calls, the harassment, and the assumption that his success was somehow an attack on her. Linda had made her own choices, and those choices had led her here. Marcus pulled out his phone and called a demolition company. He'd made his decision about what to do with the property, and it was time to move forward. Within 2 weeks, the house was gone. The demolition crew worked efficiently, tearing down walls and hauling away debris until nothing remained but a flat, empty lot. Marcus had the land graded and landscaped, installing attractive pavers and lighting. And then he did exactly what he'd planned from the beginning. He created a beautiful guest parking area, complete with 6 designated spaces, elegant landscaping, and a decorative border. It was tasteful, well-designed, and completely compliant with all HOA regulations. Marcus even submitted the plans to the HOA board and received their enthusiastic approval. Robert Mitchell personally complimented him on creating an amenity that would benefit the entire neighborhood. The irony was perfect. The woman who'd filed 53 complaints about his parking had lost her house, and that house had been transformed into a parking area. But it wasn't just petty revenge. The space was genuinely useful. When Marcus's extended family visited for Thanksgiving, there was plenty of room for everyone. When Jennifer hosted her book club, her friends had convenient parking. When they had dinner parties or holiday gatherings, guests no longer had to hunt for street parking. The neighborhood reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors complimented the design and appreciated having the extra parking available for their own visitors. The lot, which had been an eyesore during the foreclosure process, was now an attractive and functional addition to the street. But Marcus's story with Linda wasn't quite over, because 3 months after the demolition, he received an unexpected letter that would reveal where Linda had gone and what she'd done after losing everything. The letter would force Marcus to confront the human cost of his victory and decide whether justice had truly been served or whether he'd simply become another player in a cycle of bitterness and revenge. The letter arrived on a cold January morning, 3 months after Marcus had completed his guest parking area. It was handwritten on plain white paper, the envelope addressed simply to the Chen family, with no return address. Jennifer brought it in with the rest of the mail, and they opened it together at the kitchen table. The handwriting was shaky but legible, and the message was brief. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, you don't know me, but I'm Linda Hargrove's sister, Patricia. Linda asked me to write to you because she doesn't have the courage to do it herself. She wanted you to know that she's sorry for everything she put you through. She knows her behavior was inexcusable, and she takes full responsibility for her actions. She also wanted you to know that she's getting help now, and she hopes that someday you might be able to forgive her, though she understands if you can't. She's not asking for anything, just wanted you to know that she's sorry. Sincerely, Patricia Hargrove. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. First surprise, then skepticism, then something he hadn't expected, curiosity. After 6 months of conflict and 3 months of silence, Linda was suddenly real to him again, not as an antagonist or a problem to be solved, but as a person who'd hit rock bottom and was apparently trying to climb back up. Jennifer saw his expression and reached across the table to take his hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking I want to know what happened to her," Marcus admitted. "After the foreclosure, after she left. I want to know where she went and what getting help means." The letter had included a phone number for Patricia, presumably in case the Chens wanted to respond. Marcus stared at it for a long time before making a decision that surprised even himself. He called. Patricia Hargrove answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm but cautious, as if she'd been expecting the call but wasn't sure how it would go. Marcus introduced himself and thanked her for the letter, then asked the question that had been on his mind since reading it. "What happened to Linda after she left Pleasant Valley?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, then sighed deeply. "It's not a pretty story," she said, "but if you really want to know, I'll tell you." According to Patricia, Linda had nowhere to go when she left the house. Her divorce had alienated her from most of her friends, and pride had kept her from reaching out to family until she had no other choice. She'd spent 2 weeks living in her car, parked in various locations around the city, before finally calling Patricia in desperation. Patricia lived in Oregon and hadn't spoken to her sister in over a year, the result of an argument about Linda's financial decisions and her refusal to accept help or advice. But when Linda called, broke and homeless and clearly at the end of her rope, Patricia drove down to California immediately. What Patricia found shocked her. Linda had lost significant weight, looked exhausted and defeated, and was clearly suffering from severe depression and anxiety. The wine business failure, the foreclosure, and the months of conflict with Marcus had taken a devastating toll. Linda admitted to Patricia that she'd been having panic attacks, wasn't sleeping, and had been having dark thoughts about whether life was worth continuing. Patricia brought Linda back to Oregon and insisted she see a therapist. It took weeks of convincing, but Linda eventually agreed. The therapy sessions revealed what Patricia had suspected. Linda's behavior toward Marcus hadn't been about parking at all. It had been about control, displacement, and her own feelings of failure and inadequacy. Linda's therapist explained that she'd been projecting her anger about her divorce, her financial situation, and her inability to succeed onto Marcus. He represented everything she'd lost: stability, success, a happy marriage, financial security. Every time she saw his expensive cars or his well-maintained house, it reminded her of her own failures. Filing complaints had been her way of exerting control in a life that felt completely out of control. "She knows it doesn't excuse what she did," Patricia told Marcus, "but understanding why she did it has been important for her recovery. She was drowning, and instead of asking for help, She tried to pull someone else down with her. That's not who my sister really is, Mr. Chen. That's who she became when she was at her worst. Marcus listened, absorbing this new perspective on the woman who'd made his life difficult for 6 months. How is she doing now? He asked. Patricia's voice brightened slightly. Better. She's working part-time at a bookstore here in Portland. She's living with me, paying what rent she can, and seeing her therapist twice a week. She's also attending a support group for people dealing with financial crisis and bankruptcy. She's not thriving, but she's surviving, and that's a huge improvement from where she was. Then Patricia said something that caught Marcus off guard. She also wanted me to tell you that she knows about the parking area. She saw pictures online somehow, maybe from the neighborhood social media group or something. She said it was exactly what she deserved, and she hopes you and your family enjoy it. She said the irony wasn't lost on her, and if she could laugh about anything right now, she might laugh about that. Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd expected anger or resentment, perhaps a demand that he feel guilty for profiting from her loss. He hadn't expected acknowledgement, acceptance, or this strange gesture toward reconciliation. Mr. Chen, Patricia continued, Linda isn't asking you for anything. She knows she can't undo what she did or make it right. But she wanted you to know she's sorry, and she wanted you to understand that her behavior wasn't really about you. It was about her own pain, and she's ashamed that she inflicted that pain on you and your family. After hanging up with Patricia, Marcus sat at his kitchen table for a long time, thinking about everything he'd learned. Jennifer joined him, and they talked through the implications of the call. The woman who'd been a source of frustration and conflict for so long was now revealed as someone who'd been suffering deeply, lashing out from a place of desperation and mental illness. Does knowing all this change how you feel about what happened? Jennifer asked. Marcus considered carefully. Yes and no, he finally said. I understand her better now, and I feel sympathy for what she was going through. But she still made my life miserable for 6 months. Understanding why doesn't erase the impact. At the same time, I don't feel the satisfaction I thought I would about the parking area. It just feels complicated. Over the next few weeks, Marcus found himself thinking about Linda frequently. He thought about the parallel trajectories their lives had taken. His upward, hers downward, and how the distance between them had fueled her resentment. He thought about how easily circumstances could have been different, how a few bad decisions or unfortunate events could have put him in a similar desperate situation. He also thought about the parking area now being used regularly by neighbors and guests. It was undeniably useful and attractive, and everyone who saw it complimented the addition to the neighborhood, but it had been built, at least partially, as a monument to his victory over Linda. Knowing her full story made that victory feel hollow. In February, Marcus made a decision that surprised Jennifer and would have shocked his friends if he'd told them. He made a donation to a nonprofit organization that provided financial counseling and support to people facing foreclosure and bankruptcy. The donation was substantial, made anonymously, and designated specifically for their counseling services. He couldn't help Linda directly, but he could help people in similar situations, maybe preventing them from making the desperate choices Linda had made. He also did something else. He wrote a letter back to Patricia, asking her to share it with Linda when she felt it was appropriate. In the letter, he acknowledged her apology and told her that while the 6 months of conflict had been difficult, he understood that she'd been struggling. He told her he hoped she continued to get help and rebuild her life. He didn't offer forgiveness explicitly because he wasn't entirely sure he'd reached that point yet, but he offered something perhaps more valuable: acknowledgement that she was more than the worst version of herself. Patricia called 2 weeks later to thank him for the letter. She said Linda had cried when she read it, and that it had been an important step in her healing process. Patricia also shared that Linda had been accepted into a certification program for addiction counseling, wanting to use her own experiences with destructive behavior to help others. She's thinking about specializing in working with people whose stress and financial problems lead them to harmful coping mechanisms, Patricia explained. She says if she can help even one person avoid the mistakes she made, Maybe some good can come from all this. Marcus found himself genuinely hoping Linda succeeded. Not because it would vindicate his actions or absolve her of responsibility, but because people deserve the chance to recover from their worst moments and become better versions of themselves. Spring arrived in Pleasant Valley, and with it came a neighborhood block party. Marcus and Jennifer attended, mingling with neighbors they'd known for years and some new families who'd moved in recently. Multiple people complimented the parking area, which had become a genuine amenity for the community. One neighbor joked that it should be named Chen Commons in recognition of Marcus's contribution to the neighborhood. Robert Mitchell, the HOA board president, pulled Marcus aside during the party. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that we've implemented new procedures for handling complaints because of what happened with Ms. Hargrove. We're now requiring in-person meetings for anyone who files more than 3 complaints in a month, and we've created a mediation process for neighbor disputes. We don't want anyone to fall through the cracks like she did, and we don't want anyone else to be harassed the way you were." Marcus appreciated the changes, recognizing that some good had come from an unfortunate situation. The HOA had learned that excessive complaints could be a sign of someone in crisis, and they'd created systems to address both the behavior and the underlying issues. As summer approached, Marcus received one more letter from Oregon. This one was directly from Linda, written in the same shaky handwriting as the first letter Patricia had sent. It was longer, more detailed, and more personal than he'd expected. Linda wrote about her journey over the past year, the divorce that had destroyed her confidence, the poor financial decisions driven by desperation, the wine business that had seemed like salvation but became another anchor pulling her down. She wrote about how she'd felt seeing Marcus's success every day, how it had seemed like a deliberate reminder of everything she'd lost and couldn't have. She took full responsibility for her actions, acknowledging that her behavior had been irrational, harmful, and completely unjustified. She explained that therapy had helped her understand that her anger at Marcus had really been anger at herself, projected onto a convenient target. She wrote that she'd learned about displacement, about how people in crisis often lash out at those around them, rather than addressing the real source of their pain. But the part of the letter that affected Marcus most deeply was near the end. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for buying my house or for what you did with the property. In a strange way, I'm grateful for it. Seeing those pictures, seeing the parking area where my house used to stand, was like a mirror showing me exactly how absurd my behavior had been. I spent 6 months complaining about your parking, and now my house is literally a parking lot. The universe has a sense of irony, doesn't it? But more than that, knowing that something useful and positive came from that property feels right. My house was a place of failure and desperation. Now it's a place where families gather, where friends park when they visit their loved ones, where the neighborhood comes together. That's a better legacy than what I left there. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Mr. Chen. I'm not sure I deserve that, but I wanted you to know that I've forgiven myself, which my therapist says is the first step toward becoming a better person. And I wanted to thank you for responding to Patricia's letter with kindness when you had every right to respond with anger. That kindness made a difference in my recovery." Marcus read the letter several times, sharing it with Jennifer. They talked late into the night about forgiveness, about justice, about whether there was a difference between deserving consequences and deserving compassion. "She lost her house because of her own choices," Marcus said. "The foreclosure, the financial problems, the illegal business, those were all consequences of her decisions. But she also lost it because she was mentally ill and didn't get help." "Where's the line between justice and cruelty?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "I think the line is where you are right now," she finally said. "You didn't cause her problems. You didn't report her illegal business to the authorities when you could have made things much worse for her. You bought property that was being auctioned regardless of whether you bid on it. You made a legal investment that happened to have personal significance. But you also acknowledged her humanity when she reached out. That's the line. You protected yourself and your family, but you didn't try to destroy her." Marcus realized Jennifer was right. He'd responded to Linda's harassment by documenting his compliance and ultimately by making a savvy real estate investment. He hadn't filed retaliatory complaints, hadn't reported her business operation to criminal authorities, hadn't tried to make her life worse than it already was. He'd protected his interests while leaving room for her to be human. He wrote back to Linda a shorter letter this time. He told her he accepted her apology and appreciated her honesty about her struggles. He told her about the changes the HOA had implemented, hoping that sharing something positive that came from their conflict might help her healing. He wished her well in her counseling certification program and genuinely meant it. The correspondence ended there. Marcus didn't need or want an ongoing relationship with Linda, and she seemed to understand that. But the exchange of letters had provided closure for both of them, a recognition that people are more complex than their worst behaviors, and that understanding doesn't require excusing. A year after Linda's foreclosure, Marcus stood in the parking area on a warm summer evening, watching as his extended family arrived for a reunion. Cars filled the spaces he'd created, and the area buzzed with the happy chaos of relatives greeting each other, children running around, and the smell of barbecue drifting from his backyard. His mother came over and put her arm around his shoulders. "This turned out beautifully," she said, gesturing at the landscaped parking area. "And I heard it has quite a story behind it," Marcus smiled. "It does. A complicated story about conflict and consequences, about people at their worst and their attempts to be better. But mostly I think it's a story about how sometimes the things that seem like problems contain opportunities if you're patient enough to see them." His mother laughed. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you turned your nightmare neighbor's house into a parking lot." "Maybe," Marcus admitted, "but it's also true that something good came from something bad. This space serves a purpose. The neighborhood is better for it. And somewhere in Oregon, a woman who was drowning has found solid ground. That feels like the right ending." As the evening wore on and the party grew louder and more joyful, Marcus found himself thinking one last time about Linda Hargrove. He hoped she was doing well. He hoped her certification program was going smoothly. He hoped she'd found peace with her past and was building a better future. But mostly he hoped that both of them had learned something from their conflict. Linda had learned painfully that attacking others doesn't solve your own problems, and that asking for help is stronger than suffering in destructive silence. Marcus had learned that understanding someone's pain doesn't mean accepting their harmful behavior, and that justice and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. The parking area stood as a monument to all of it, to conflict and resolution, to consequence and recovery, to the complexity of human relationships, and the possibility of growth even in difficult circumstances. Cars came and went, families gathered and departed, and life in Pleasant Valley continued. The Karen who'd reported illegal parking for 6 months had lost her house, and that house had become exactly what she'd claimed to hate. The irony was perfect, the justice was served, and yet somehow, in the end, everyone involved had become slightly better versions of themselves. Marcus had his parking area fully legal and HOA approved. Linda had her second chance at a meaningful life, and both of them had learned that the most satisfying victories aren't about crushing your enemies, but about finding ways to move forward that leave room for everyone to be human. As the stars came out and the party continued, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in over a year. The conflict was over, the lessons were learned, and the future was bright. Sometimes, he reflected, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply building something good from the wreckage and having the grace to wish your former antagonist well as they try to do the same. The parking area would remain a permanent feature of the neighborhood landscape, but the story behind it, the human drama of two people caught in circumstances that brought out their worst and eventually their better selves, that story would fade with time until it was just another neighborhood legend. Marcus was okay with that. Some stories don't need to be remembered forever. Some stories just need to be learned from, resolved with as much grace as possible, and then allowed to rest. He looked at the space where Linda's house had stood, now filled with family and friends, and the vehicles she'd once complained about so bitterly. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he felt no anger, no resentment, no need for vindication. He felt simply grateful that it was over, and that everyone involved had survived to become wiser, kinder, and more understanding of the struggles others might be hiding behind their worst behaviors. The parking wars were over, life in Pleasant Valley had returned to normal, and somewhere in Oregon, a woman was rebuilding her life one day at a time, carrying with her the lessons learned from her lowest point and the unexpected grace shown by the man she'd wronged. It wasn't the ending Marcus had imagined when the conflict began, but it was perhaps the best ending possible. Not because anyone won, but because everyone survived, learned, and moved forward. And really, that's all anyone can ask for. The end.